Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to the Puna Haumaru seminar series. Today I am so excited to invite Associate Professor Benjamin Spivak to speak with us. And full disclosure, this is my particular area of interest, so I'm extra excited today. Associate Professor Spivak received his PhD in 2016 and he's employed at the Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, Australia. He's published more than 45 peer-reviewed papers on the topics of risk assessment, family violence, criminal justice contact among young people, and child maltreatment. And for the past decade, Dr. Spivak has worked on a program of research examining risk assessment of family violence, which has included the development of prediction models and the examination of disparities in prediction among different demographic groups. So today we're going to hear about a particularly hot topic, which is the prediction of homicide. And I'm really happy to hand over to you, Ben.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, April. Kia ora, everybody, and thank you so much for attending. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from where I'm presenting from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. If there are any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today, I'll extend that respect to them as well. So, shall we begin? Today, as you can see, hopefully everyone can see my slides quite clearly. We're looking at whether it's possible to predict lethal and non-lethal family violence. Really, this kind of project, it's really kind of this paper was developed over kind of a couple of years. So we've kind of been working through it. We've had kind of working papers for a while. But I'm happy to report that this week the paper was finally published in the Journal of Family Violence, so this couldn't be better timing. Before we begin, just a bit of a disclaimer. This research uses Victoria Police data, but we're not speaking on behalf of Victoria Police, so the views that I kind of present here don't have any bearing on, Victoria Police's position on any of these matters. And we have no conflicts of interest to declare in relation to this. Also, can I just acknowledge my co-authors on this paper, Dr. Michael True, who's a lecturer here at the Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science and co-led the paper with me, Professor Troy McEwen and Professor James Ogloff, many of you will know, both mentored and were senior authors on the paper as well. Thanks to them. So, many of you will, if you kind of pay attention to the news, will have seen articles, headlines like the ones before you on the screen. The first one at the top there from the Huffington Post, talking about, unfortunately, domestic violence homicide. The second talking about kind of statistics in relation to family homicide. And what they all seem to have in common, these kind of articles that you'll see pop up again and again, is this idea that homicide, particularly family violence homicide, particularly intimate partner violence homicide, is a predictable event. That if only we had known something in advance, it would be very easy to predict who would kind of go on to perpetrate a homicide and prevent that homicide. Now, these kind of ideas really come out of research. They're not kind of a journalist's fever dream that they've put together. They're really informed by the academic literature. There's been a number of studies conducted over the past 2 decades in relation to factors that are associated with homicide in family violence and intimate partner context. So much so that there's been a number of systematic reviews on the topic. The most kind of commonly cited systematic review was conducted by Spencer and Stith in, I believe, 2020. And really, they tend to kind of they tend to have kind of common points of agreement in terms of the risk factors that are kind of identified as associated with homicide. You'll see some of those before you on the screen. There's essentially 12 that commonly come up. These range from access to firearms to threats to kill, to previous family violence, previous physical violence, to alcohol and substance use, to unemployment. A lot of them are common risk factors for offending more generally as well. Some not so much. And beyond kind of influencing media reporting, this kind of risk assessment literature in the domain of family violence homicide has also influenced practice. So it's led to the development of a number of so-called risk assessment instruments in this area that purport to be able to predict the likelihood of somebody committing a homicide based on, based on information about a person's history, and incorporating many of those risk factors that were identified in the earlier slide. A really common set of risk assessments in this area come out of the States: the danger assessment and the lethality screen. So these are very short screens used by people within the family violence or domestic violence sector and by law enforcement. And the essential idea here is it's essentially an actuarial tool in which the person ticks whether any of these risk factors are present. The more of these factors that are present, the more likely the person is to perpetrate a homicide or to be victimised through homicide. Closer to home, the Australian National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, ANROS, has provided guidance of a similar nature in relation to risk assessment for family violence cases. So identifying many of those same risk factors, as you can see before you, with the intention of screening or assessing a person's level of dangerousness and whether they're likely to perpetrate or be victimised in a homicide. More broadly, you see these come out not so much in structured tools, but in risk assessment and management frameworks. So they're very commonly referenced. You see at the top there, this is the risk assessment and management framework used in the Northern Territory. This is the second kind of picture is from the ANROS, from the Australian National Research Organisation for Women's Safety that I mentioned a moment ago. And the third one here comes from New Zealand. So this is the Family Violence Risk Assessment and Management Framework, which also talks about kind of what they call lethality assessment, which is another way of talking about kind of assessment for the likelihood of kind of lethal violence or homicide. I will say kind of the New Zealand, I'm going to call it FVRAM, does have appropriate caveats kind of in there around kind of not using these kind of risk factors as markers rather than kind of attempting to predict. But not every kind of risk assessment and management framework is so cautious in how they talk about prediction. Here's an example of how it might work in practice. This is a risk assessment framework used in Victoria. As you can see, what's highlighted in yellow there, all of these different risk factors, but these are commonly risk factors that are used or identified in the literature as associated with homicide. So what we have here, we have a kind of a research base that seems to have informed reporting and practice in terms of like predicting homicide. But what does the research base actually kind of look like if we kind of delve beyond the systematic reviews? Well, it turns out when you start looking at a lot of this research, and you'll see if you kind of look at our paper, we did a kind of somewhat of a thorough review of the literature and table a lot of this research. But what you tend to find is that a lot of the research on which these kind of putative risk factors are based are not fit for purpose. So many of them are just descriptive studies of homicide cases. So this is a kind of study design in which researchers will take a large number of cases in which a person was murdered by a family member and look at the kind of characteristics of the perpetrator and their history. So they might find, for instance, that let's say 70% of homicide victims had a perpetrator who had displayed controlling behaviour in the past. The these studies can be very useful, just not for prediction. The reason for this is kind of twofold. The first is that you don't have a comparison group. So let's say we know that 70% of people who are victimized through homicide have a perpetrator who's displayed controlling behavior. We don't know what that kind of rate is like for people who don't perpetrate homicide or aren't victimized by homicide. That lack of a comparison group makes it really difficult for us to say anything about, makes it actually impossible for us to say anything with confidence about prediction. The second reason is really follow-up. So in many cases, we don't really have kind of a lot of a standardized time from the identification of a risk factor, let's say controlling behavior again, it might be past family violence, to the outcome. So we don't know how long it will take from the point of identification to the event that we're interested in predicting. So descriptive studies, we don't even include them in our table. They're entirely irrelevant for the purposes of prediction. Case control studies are another matter, and I'll explain those in a moment, but essentially what it involves, it comes out of epidemiology, and it's used for the study of rare events. And the idea behind case control studies is that you collect a large sample of people with the event of interest, let's say people who've perpetrated homicide or people who've been victimized by homicide, and you collect an equally large number of people who don't have the event of interest, so haven't been killed, and then you compare their characteristics across the two groups. Now, case control studies, again, can be very informative in determining how two groups are different. That's quite different from prediction, okay? And you'll see why in just a moment. The study design that is best and is fit for purpose for assessing risk, for predicting an event like homicide, is what's called a longitudinal cohort study. Now, a longitudinal cohort study is where we kind of start off with a population of people and we're able to follow them over a certain period to determine how often an event takes place. And we might look at the characteristics of different kind of people within that population to see who is more or less likely to have that event taking place. Now, why is this study design best for assessing risk? The first reason is due to base rates. So we'll get into that in a moment, but case control studies massively inflate base rates. A longitudinal study, a cohort study, just by its very nature, will have an accurate, or should have an accurate base rate. Secondly, it deals with that problem I mentioned earlier about follow-up period. So we need to have accurate information about how long it takes from the identification of a risk factor to the event of interest, in this case, homicide. So because case control studies are just so common within the literature in this area, it's worth taking a sec just to clarify kind of how they work and the differences with kind of a longitudinal cohort study, why they're a problem. So I normally hate pie charts, but I just felt that this was kind of an appropriate use of them in this case. What you see before you is a bit of a schematic for how a case control study might work. You know, I mentioned before, typically you'll have kind of half of your sample consisting of people with an event and half of your sample consisting of people without an event. In this case, you can see in the blue, that's our homicide kind of aspect of our sample for a case control study, and our orange are people without homicide. And what we might do, we might look over 10 years and collect information on all the homicide cases involving domestic violence over 10 years. And we might compare them to a comparison group. It could be, the same number of people from the general population, or more likely the same number of people who've perhaps experienced family violence, but nothing that's kind of escalated or become a homicide. And then we'd compare them across various factors: drug use, previous violence, controlling behavior, anything we can kind of, that makes a kind of useful hypothesis in this area for how the two groups might differ. So you can see how that might be potentially useful. So, in the epidemiological context, we might be looking at Ebola And we might find, for instance, that, a West African origin or having recently visited West Africa is associated with that blue side with kind of having Ebola. And that might be an important thing to take into account. The problem from a prediction perspective with this sort of design is the fact that we're typically designed to have 50% of the sample with outcome and 50% without. From a prediction perspective, that gives you, from the get-go, a 1 in 2 chance of being correct about the probability of a homicide occurring through just guessing. That's not the reality, okay? As you might be aware, homicide, domestic homicide, family violence homicide are statistically very infrequent events, much lower than 50%, and thank goodness for that. For New Zealand, the crude percentage of family homicides by population, so if you looked at the number of homicides in 2022 and divided that by the total population, you would end up with that kind of infinitesimal number, 0.0006% of the population victims of homicide. And that's declined slightly, but it's a fairly it's always very small. It doesn't become kind of massively large over the period I've looked at. Similar, slightly lower percentage of homicides by population in Australia, so also a very infinitesimal number. What does that look like in terms of our pie chart? You can't even see the homicides, okay? And what that means is, from a prediction perspective, if we tried to predict homicide just through guessing, we've got much lower than a 1 in 2 chance. In fact, 99.94% of the time in New Zealand, we're going to be wrong, okay? What that also means is that any risk factor that we identify through a case control study will have a lot more false positives, a lot more error as a result of that kind of much lower and more realistic base rate or prevalence. Case control studies aren't the only form of research in this area. So there are studies that have used the appropriate prospective designs. We found 11 at the time of writing this paper about a year ago. However, in those studies, attrition rates were absolutely enormous. Around 40 to 45% for those 7 studies. Most of them came from the same author group. With attrition rates that enormous, you have to question the findings. Typically, when people conduct kind of quality assessments of papers, a normal criteria for kind of attrition being a problem is around 10%, 5%. In a case like this, where you have an event like homicide, which happens so infrequently, even 1% of missing data of data that 1% of the group being lost to attrition could have enormous impacts on the likelihood of a risk factor actually working, if you think about it. So if we look at that crude population rate, if we think about that earlier, that was at 0.00006. 1% would kind of increase that by a factor of, I don't know, hundreds. So it can make a huge difference. 40 to 45% is just ridiculous in terms of the amount of error that could be introduced. I should say, not the fault of the researchers. It's an incredibly difficult area to study, particularly in the way they did. So they asked people to, they followed up people they looked at people through self-report and then followed up, which is really, really challenging. Now, that wasn't all the studies. So the 2 studies that kind of were able to kind of look at their sample prospectively without any attrition had other issues. One study had a really tiny sample size. It was followed up for, I believe, 5 years. I believe Stephen Hart and his colleague. And it had an extremely tiny sample size of 100. That study, really interestingly, had no cases of homicide reported over that 5-year period. So they couldn't predict anything. Hence, they couldn't provide us with any kind of evidence on predictive utility or predictive validity. The second study was really excellent. It's actually not published yet. It's a working paper by Aurora and colleagues in Chicago. They followed up cases for 9 years, but found huge error rates in prediction of homicides. So 98% of cases predicted to result in homicide did not after 9 years. And second limitation of the study is it's not quite clear from the paper, but it didn't appear to include a lot of the risk factors that have previously been kind of nominated as important in those meta-analyses. You know, things like choking and strangulation and controlling behaviour and so on. So there are some gaps in our knowledge. We have no population-based prospective studies that allow inference about prediction without significant attrition, aside from really one. There's no studies with suitable designs that examine those risk factors that have been identified as extremely important red flags for homicide. And none of the research has been on family violence. It's all been intimate partner violence related. Now, New Zealand, like Victoria, is obviously a jurisdiction that really sees the importance of family violence and family violence as a concept, but not all jurisdictions are the same. So it's not surprising that we've had no research, but it is clearly a gap in our knowledge and important for practice here. And of course, no Australian research. So we hope to fill those gaps. And our research questions were simple. The first one was whether we could predict what we're calling lethal or near lethal family violence, which I'll explain in a moment, using those commonly recognised risk factors for intimate partner homicide. We wanted to know whether any specific risk factors on their own individually could predict lethal or near lethal violence, and whether in combination, using them together, we could potentially predict lethal or near lethal family violence. As part of that, we wanted to look at whether specific risk factors added kind of to prediction above kind of other risk factors. So we're looking at them alone and in combination. Something I won't report on here, but that we also looked at was the performance of an actuarial tool that we developed previously to predict family violence more generally. I won't be reporting on the results, but just so you know, that didn't work very well. So that's that. So what was our method? Well, I talked to you a moment ago about the importance of having a cohort study, a longitudinal cohort study. That's exactly what we did. And we used police-recorded family violence. We were lucky enough to get cooperation, and we have very good partners here in Victoria Police who provided us with a really extensive data set. It was a 7-month population of all family violence reports that were recorded by Victoria Police from September 2019 to March 2020. So that's 38,454 reports. Each report has a nominated person as the kind of alleged perpetrator, usually referred to as the respondent, and a person identified as the primary victim, referred to as the affected family member. Overall, while we had 38,454 reports, this gave us 34,735 unique perpetrators. Some perpetrators obviously victimised kind of different unique family members, so they could be counted more than once. However, we analysed them kind of uniquely and kind of through the reports, so both ways, and our results don't differ substantially. Each party was followed up in Victoria Police databases for a year from the original family violence report. So the original call out by police to attend a family violence incident was followed up. They were followed up from that point for about a year. And our outcome here, which is where I'll explain it, is lethal and near lethal outcomes. Originally, we did want to look at only kind of homicide offences, but the numbers were so low that we couldn't get permission. It probably wouldn't have been ethically okay to do that because they were they'd be easily identifiable. So we compromised and we looked at any kind of authorised or unauthorised charges that involved homicide offences, of course, but also offences that would have come very close to homicide. If something hadn't happened, they could have easily tipped over into that. So these were intentionally, recklessly, or attempting to cause serious injury involving gross violence. Gross violence means that they planned to cause serious injury, took a weapon to cause injury and used it, did it in company and continued to act, or did it in company and continued to act in ways that caused injury after the person was incapacitated. So pretty serious stuff. How did we get the risk factors that I identified earlier? Well, we drew risk factors from what's called the L17 Family Violence Report. So in Victoria, when police attend a call out for family violence, or when they identify family violence as being present, they're mandatorily required to fill out paperwork at the scene and after leaving as well. And this form is known as the L17, and it contains both risk factors relating to that actuarial assessment I mentioned a moment ago, known as the VP SAFER, and about 38 other kind of risk factors, many of which, actually 12 of which overlap with those risk factors I mentioned earlier. So they could be used to predict, to see whether those red flags predicted homicide. They are reported by police following interviews with the perpetrator and the affected family member. And they're scored yes, no, and info not available. The moment you've all been waiting for. What did we find? This really tells us where we're going. Overall, out of those nearly 39,000 cases, we had 55 cases of lethal or near lethal violence. That's 0.14% of the sample. Expanding that beyond kind of homicide still didn't give us a huge kind of number of cases. In terms of the rate per 100,000 people, that's 140 per 100,000 people. Not common at all. As I mentioned earlier, makes things difficult to predict. There you see it in the pie chart. You can't see the lethal and the lethal violence. In Victoria, the rate of domestic homicide is 0.24 per 100,000 people, so a lot lower. That's to be expected to some degree. We're dealing with a riskier population here. So any respondent or alleged perpetrator who's come to police attention is likely to kind of have a much higher likelihood of committing these sorts of offences compared to the general population. So that's not unexpected. But still, despite the fact that we're so much higher in terms of our rate, it's still incredibly low, which says something. How do we go in terms of our risk factors individually? Well, let me take you through this table. This tells a lot of the story as well. What you see before you are essentially a set of frequencies and our odds ratio. The odds ratio tells us the odds of having intimate partner, lethal or near lethal intimate partner violence compared to non-lethal intimate partner violence in this case. Results were very similar for family violence more generally. So let me take you through one example here. This is strangulation or choking, a commonly kind of recognized risk factors. Here you can see overall, we have 3,191 people within our sample, about 8.3%, that were recorded as strangling or choking their AFM. So not an insubstantial amount. The key is in the next two columns. On the left here, we see the rate of people who had lethal or near lethal intimate partner violence who were also engaged in strangling or choking an AFM. Less than 6. We couldn't report numbers lower than that for fear of identifying individuals, but a really small amount. The vast majority, over 99.81% of people who strangled or choked didn't go on to have lethal or near lethal family intimate partner violence in that 12-month follow-up period. Okay. And in fact, our odds ratio here was not significant. So it didn't predict lethal or near lethal violence over that 12-month period. In fact, we only had 3 significant predictors out of those 12 that we checked. One was unemployment, okay, which was positively related. You can see an odds ratio here of 1.86, meaning the odds are 1.86 times higher for people who are unemployed of engaging in intimate partner violence. Lethal and near lethal family and intimate partner violence. It's a bit of a mouthful. I'll just call it the outcome. And we have an identical odds ratio for substance problems, okay, in the same direction. And finally, we had the respondent age with younger people more likely to engage in lethal or near lethal family or intimate partner violence. The thing to take into account is that even though they were significantly associated, you can see here in our third column that still the vast majority of people with this risk factor won't go on to perpetrate lethal or near lethal violence. So if you're to use these risk factors as a red flag, what that tells you is, more than 99% of people with that red flag won't go on to have the outcome of interest. Okay. So to recap, 55 cases of lethal or near lethal violence and 3 risk factors that were significantly associated. Well, that was a bit of a kind of letdown. Okay, so we clearly can't predict lethal or near lethal violence on the basis of individual factors, but what if we combine them all together? Do any seem to come out above kind of the rest? What we did in order to kind of look at them together, we kind of combined them all into a multivariate logistic regression. And in these sorts of models, only assault while pregnant was significantly associated while adjusting for everything else with a moderately sized odds ratio. The odds were nearly 3 times higher for people who assaulted someone while pregnant to perpetrate lethal or near lethal violence. However, odds ratios can be deceiving. Despite the fact that we had kind of a decent odds ratio, the presence of this risk factor only increased the kind of probability of lethal, near lethal violence by a number which I can't repeat. It's so small. Okay, but you can see it right there before you. In other words, it doesn't make a huge difference to our ability to predict lethal or near lethal violence. We use what's called an AUC, and an AUC is a really common metric in this field. What it tells you about is the likelihood that a model kind of using all these risk factors can discriminate between someone with and without lethal and intimate partner violence. In other words, how common is it for someone who, like if we take a random person who has perpetrated lethal or near lethal violence and a random person who doesn't, how likely is the model to rank the person with lethal or near lethal violence higher in terms of risk? And it does a decent job. So an AUC ranges from 0 to 1, and AUCs above like 0.65 are generally considered decent. Our AUC was 0.67, not remarkable, but certainly not terrible. So it means that the model can discriminate between those who do and don't engage in lethal or near lethal violence. The important thing to remember with the AUC is that it's not predictive, okay? It looks backwards. So it looks at after someone's got lethal or near lethal violence, how they're ranked by the probability that they'll be ranked higher by your model. It doesn't look at a risk factor kind of going forward to kind of homicide. So it doesn't mean that prediction was accurate. What we found in terms of prediction, and this requires a little bit of explanation, is 2 things. And I have the seesaw here because models of prediction really there's a bit of kind of room for kind of movement with them in terms of setting thresholds for where we're going to kind of call something high risk. And the balance is usually between how many cases we can capture. So can we capture all people who've engaged in lethal, near lethal violence? And on the other hand, we have precision. So if we call something high risk, how likely is someone who's high risk to have lethal or near lethal violence? So there's a subtle distinction there. On the one hand, when we set things really high risk could capture 85% of people who engage in lethal or near lethal family violence under our model, which is really positive. Okay, the vast majority of people who engaged in this behaviour were captured by the model in terms of prediction. On the other hand, 99.8% of those who are captured with that sort of threshold won't go on to engage in lethal or near lethal family violence. What that means is that if we set our threshold at this kind of, at this level, and we decided to intervene, 99.8% of the people we intervened on won't go on to have the outcome that we kind of are interested in preventing. On the other hand, we could barely change this. So we could reduce the capture rate to about 25%, but that gave us only a small kind of improvement in our precision. So 99.7% of those who were high risk did not go on to engage in lethal or near lethal violence. So however we kind of played with this model, the result was the same. So we could capture all cases, but we'd be basically overwhelmed with what are called false positives, okay? Cases that wouldn't end up with the outcome of interest. So in summary, when we examined this kind of research question using an optimal prospective longitudinal design, we could only find 3 recognised risk factors for intimate partner violence, and only 1 made a unique contribution to prediction amongst all of the ones that we looked together with. None of the risk factors added meaningfully to the absolute probability of lethal or near lethal violence. And when we combined risk factors together in our model, we could discriminate between those with and without lethal near violence at a kind of moderate level, at an acceptable level, but the error rates in prediction were enormous. At best, we tried, you'll see in the paper, we tried various, we really stress tested this, and we tried a lot of different models, but at best around 997 out of every 1,000 cases that we predicted would engage in lethal and near lethal violence did not. And the more risk factors that were present, the more the model overestimated the risk of lethal or near lethal violence. Not good. So that's the results. Let me cover a few of the limitations before I go on to the implications. So obviously this study used police data and used data that was collected by police. And police may not detect the presence of risk factors for various reasons. They may fail to ask questions, and victims might not report to police. Are 2 of the most common kind of reasons we could think of for them not being able to detect the presence of risk factors. That's a limitation we can't do anything about at this stage, but it is what it is. The next 2 limitations I'm going to go through, I think, are that they've been raised before, but I think they're maybe misunderstood slightly, or too much credence is probably lended to them. So the first is that police reports vastly underestimate family violence, and that the population in the study is not representative of all family violence. That's true. It's undoubtedly true. I don't think it's as much of a limitation as people might think. Why? I don't think lethal or near lethal violence, in particular lethal violence, is underestimated in our sample. What that suggests is that prediction will be worse with a more representative sample of family violence cases. If we increase the number of people that we're predicting from, that prevalence rate goes down. Okay. What we need to see is that we're really underestimating lethal and near lethal violence to a substantial degree, which I think is a questionable assumption. Second limitation that's been raised is that we didn't control for incapacitation. So people that, following their family violence report, may have been remanded or otherwise detained, which may have reduced the rate of lethal or near lethal violence. And it's true, we didn't control for incapacitation. And it is a limitation. Potentially we could get slightly more accurate models, but the overall picture of not being able to kind of predict this low base rate event is unlikely to change, even accounting for prediction. Why? The incapacitation effects would have to be really unrealistically large to impact prediction in a meaningful sense. Don't forget, it was like 0.14% of our sample that had the outcome of interest. But in my experience, you probably need around 10% of your sample to have the outcome of interest for it to kind of be a viable outcome to predict. So for incapacitation effects to really have a meaningful impact on prediction, they would have had to reduce kind of the lethal near lethal rate by 5,000%, something ridiculous like that. So I don't think that's necessarily an issue, but certainly something for other people to look at in the future. So that's my limitations out of the way. How do we understand these findings in relation to past research that I covered earlier? Well, first things first, studies on the risk of homicide or looking to predict homicide have to take into account the prevalence in their population. Very few people with a risk factor or combinations of risk factors will engage in lethal or near lethal violence. Okay, you'll have to find kind of a risk factor that's heretofore been kind of unexplored or measured incorrectly, and I think the odds are greatly against you in terms of finding a risk factor that accurately kind of precisely predicts lethal, near lethal violence without overwhelming you with false positives. The risk factors as a result have no predictive value because the low base rate of lethal, near lethal violence means that you're just overwhelmed, by 99% false positives. Now, the thing to take into account is, this prevalence issue. So if homicide was present in 3% of cases instead of 0.14% of cases, increased odds would matter, okay? I'd put it high, I'd say 5% of cases. But thankfully, our homicide rate isn't kind of 1 in 20 or, even 3%. The homicide rate is much closer to less than 0.1%, much, much lower than that. In these sorts of situations, increased odds are interesting and useful and avenues for academic exploration. In terms of prediction, they're a lot less useful. So in terms of policy and practice, what we can say on the basis of this study and the basis of the logic that kind of we're looking at this through, we don't think risk of homicide is being assessed in a kind of meaningful way by existing lethality risk assessment instruments. They can work primarily as a screener, accepting that you're going to get like an enormous number of false positives. So whoever's coming through, the overwhelming likelihood is that they're not going to commit homicide or lethal or near lethal violence. The second point we're not so sure of, there needs to be more prospective work in this area. Our study found that many of the well-known risk factors didn't predict homicide. There are issues with previous studies, but there are issues with our study. I mentioned that it's this data that's been collected by police. So there needs to be more prospective work in this area before we can really conclude that the findings of the study in relation to how predictive each of the individual risk factors were is actually more generalizable. In terms of practice, any sort of screening of family violence cases on the basis of these risk factors has to acknowledge that, again, all cases that are screened in have to be at extremely low risk of homicide. What that means from a kind of policy perspective is that if you're implementing an intervention on the basis of this, you want to take into account that the vast majority of people that are going to be affected by that intervention won't go on to, display the outcome of interest. And that's difficult to justify. It can be justified. It's part of this is a values game or values issue, I should say. But it's an important thing to grapple with, and I don't think it's been probably grappled with enough in the literature. This idea that whatever we're implementing on the basis of these risk assessments has to be probably low cost and low harm in terms of its impact on the person you're intervening on. That, of course, hasn't stopped people from suggesting lots of pretty high-intensity interventions on the basis of a lot of these risk factors. So you can see a lot of this reporting comes from, I think most of this reporting comes from Australia, but it's a pattern that we've seen kind of worldwide in developed nations. Things like reversing the presumption of bail on the basis of risk factors, the idea that you're preventing homicide. Now, We're not saying, of course, to throw out the baby with the bathwater. A common kind of response before I get to this point is, are you saying we don't do anything about homicide? And of course, we're not saying that at all. What we're saying is a bit more subtle, okay? We're saying be humble about the accuracy of these risk assessments, recognize that you're going to be facing a lot of cases, even with the most well-validated risk assessments in this area, you're going to be facing a lot of cases that don't have the outcome of interest. And so you're going to be intervening on a lot of people who may not need that intervention. So what we can do is take an approach that recognizes the limitations of that prediction and balances the effects of intervention with those harms, recognizing that we're going to be kind of doing this to a lot of people who, won't have the outcome, but we're going to be exposing them to kind of the negatives of intervention. In a way, what we call this in the paper is kind of a public health approach. So screening with public health, if you think about something like a heart attack, not everybody that screens positive for like heart disease needs to get bypass surgery. And not everyone that screens high on these risk factors needs to kind of immediately be detained or have an ankle monitor. Okay. What it might mean is that in the first instance, these screening tools might be useful just to implement probably low cost, low harm interventions. And I was happy to see that not long before this presentation, maybe a month ago, this paper was brought to my attention. It's published in 2024, and it actually looks at a program that was developed off the back of the lethality assessment, one of the risk assessments I mentioned earlier, designed to predict lethal violence amongst intimate partners. Now, the thing with the lethality assessment program is that the intervention is fairly low cost and arguably not really harmful to anyone. So really, when people screen in positive, they get risk awareness and safety planning, either by police or by people from the sector and referrals. It allows victims to take self-protective actions. This study, I recommend you have a look at. It's well done. Concluded that the lethality assessment program reduced female homicides committed by men by 40%. It's fairly robust. The only thing they kind of have to deal with is that 40% probably doesn't kind of relate to a lot of homicides because the homicide rate is so low. There's other things we can do as well. One thing is probably to reduce, and this is hard because it's a high impact event, but to reduce the dominant focus on homicide and risk assessment and management in this area. We could focus risk assessment on future family violence, which is a lot more prevalent, and even severe forms of that family violence, which we've done. These things can be predicted. I know I've done it. And we can prioritize intervention for those cases. Likely, amongst those cases that we're predicting for future family violence or even severe family violence will be a handful of cases that would have resulted in homicide. And you'll have the kind of double benefit of preventing kind of family violence that doesn't escalate to homicide as well. Provide support and intervention for broader drivers of family violence at primary and secondary levels. So a more broader preventative approach as well, which is currently being done, of course. The other things we can do is prioritize safety measures in a more dynamic way. So my co-author, Troy McEwen, does a lot of work in this area. She talks about shifting from risk assessment, which really is around prediction, to threat assessment. Threat assessment is the idea of taking concerns around kind of the current target threat and not making predictions about longer term risk. So looking at things like escalation in the kind of short term and taking into account time in terms of like these risk factors and kind of using that flexibility to determine or make an assessment about the likely level of threat. That could potentially be a way forward in this area. However, it shouldn't be accepted unquestioningly. How we ended up with this paper is that, I don't think there's been enough scrutiny on kind of risk assessment and homicide. And we don't want to fall into this trap with threat assessment either. So it's quite possible that, the threat assessment approach, while being flexible and allowing you to consider a range of acute dynamic indicators, is not associated with severe violence or homicide, and interventions premised on that are not effective. So what we really need is, if we are going to implement that approach, like any approach, we have to evaluate whether it's actually going to reduce harm in the population when applied in practice. As with any of these studies, a prospective research design with a control sample is required, ideally an RCT. Okay, and I think that brings me to the end of my talk.